Very distinguished guests with us this afternoon, and it's good to have all of them. John Hunt is here, Governor Clement Comer Clay is here, and Alberta Chapman Taylor is here to visit this afternoon. I do have some bad news. David Todd is in New Mexico, so he will not be here. And Thomas Freeman, the Surveyor General, is unavailable this afternoon, but John Hunt came back to visit us this afternoon for all of you folks who were not able to be here last year. He has come back to catch us up today on a little Huntsville history. We're glad to have all of you, so let's hear from our visitors. Mr. Hunt will be first.
Thank you so much. Bill Nine does a lot for LearningQUEST. As you know, he sponsors a lot of these programs. He's our incoming president next year for the Huntsville Pilgrimage Association that annually puts on the cemetery stroll, except for the last 2 years. So it's the first time in over 3 decades. Last year we couldn't do it because of COVID and cutbacks in Huntsville City, and the same thing happened this year. But we are fervently praying that next year we'll be back. Always the third Sunday in October at Maple Hill. The last one we did was a bicentennial. It was the biggest we ever did. We had over 90 characters and around 12 to 13,000 people attended. So it's a big show and we're able to put it on. Let me mention a couple of things before I get started with my shtick here. We'd love to have you as a patron in HBA. Have a couple of application forms, newsletters that go out 3 times a year, always have application forms in them. You can join for as little as $35 a year. And we just got these write cards in. I wish I brought more of them. But if you want to wait, as I told Dean, a couple of weeks for the leaves to turn, go over one afternoon to Maple Hill. Just do your smartphone on the QR code, and it'll take you to over 50 famous individuals buried there, give you directions. They'll have a narrative, photos, etc. So even though we didn't get to do the stroll this year, you can do your own improvised stroll if you would like to. So if you want to grab one of these afterward, and there are some in the Maple Hill office, you can go on a day other than Sunday. 2 other statements before I jump into character here. This area that became Huntsville was overlapped between Chickasaw and Cherokee territories. So when I start telling the story of the first white man to settle here, remember, for hundreds of years there have been Native Americans frequenting this big spring area. So if you had a good water source, you would have reoccurring encounters and so forth. Unfortunately, we don't have written records left from them about what was happening here before 1804. Secondly, when I'm doing all my gyrations, I'm standing in Maple Hill Cemetery, okay? So my distances won't quite jive the Trinity Church. But John Hunt would have hunted where we're standing today, okay? Because he was right down in what now John Hunt Park for years. So he would have been all over this area. I try to use my notes because when I do my stock presentation at the graveside, it's a little bit shorter. I'm trying to embellish a little bit so I don't get totally convoluted. I'll try to refer to my notes occasionally. After I finish, since we only have 3 speakers today, I can go a little bit longer than the 15 minutes. I'll be glad to answer your questions, not just about Hunt, but early Huntsville history, which we're all intrigued by, I'm sure. Good afternoon. Praise to the Lord to see so many beautiful bells and distinguished gentlemen in this audience today. My name is Captain John Hunt. I'm a soldier, politician, lawman, and land speculator. But most important for you as Huntsvillians, like my more famous contemporary, Daniel Boone, I am a woodsman and an explorer. In 1805, I settled my family about 1.3 miles from this very spot. I built a 2-room poplar log cabin about 75 yards from the big spring. It's on what is the parking lot of Huntsville Utilities today, if it was still standing. So I'm just as pleased as a pig in slop to be able to tell you about the real founder of Huntsville today. I was born in Virginia in 1750. My ancestors were Dutch-Irish. I grew up to be about 5'10", 180, which was a big man back then. I received enough schooling that I could write well and do basic math. In 1770, I married Joanna Holbrook, and we eventually had 7 children together. We moved to North Carolina, where I briefly served in the Revolutionary War as a soldier, and in the North Carolina House of Commons as a clerk. There's some of my writings that are still on file there. We moved again to Tennessee with our growing family, and I became a captain of the militia and sheriff in Claiborne County, and I'm credited with being the founder of Caswell, Tennessee. That's about 258 miles north of here, just north of Knoxville. In almost every place I lived, I was either appointed or elected to a post of importance. And it was actually in Tennessee that I became infatuated with land acquisition. The way it worked back then, an enterprising fellow could become a squatter on lands the U.S. government was about to acquire from the Native American Indians. And that would supposedly give you a claim for it when it officially went on sale. So the legal term, you became a tenant at will. Supposedly gave you an advantage. Well, in 1804, my post as sheriff had run out, and I got the itch again. So I decided to seize an opportunity to go south into what was then the Mississippi Territory. Now, did my wife agree with me for another grand adventure? She stayed in Tennessee and never came to Huntsville. As did one of my sons, John. He didn't go by John Jr. I'll get to this in a moment, but there's some confusion about John Hunt. My father was John Hunt. I'm John Hunt. My son's John Hunt. I have a cousin, John Hunt. Can't swing a dead cat without hitting a John Hunt in the early 19th century. And that's caused some historical confusion. In September of 1804, at age 55, I set out with my friend Andrew Bean on horseback south. We finally came to the Flint River in what is Newmarket. The first settlers in this area were the Kreiner brothers, so I was visiting with Joseph Kreiner, and that night, as we were eating Miss Kreiner's scratch biscuits, all you ladies make scratch biscuits, right? Yes, yes. He first told me of the marvelous big spring where pure fresh water gushed from the side of a rock cliff. Well, I'm here to say that me and Bean the next day skedaddled down here faster than an 8-legged dog. We found the big spring and holy cow, somebody had already cut some poplar logs. It seems a Samuel Davis had started a cabin, but went back to Georgia to get his family. So, I hastily erected a cabin which gave me the squatter's rights to control the land, being eventually settled back in Salem, Tennessee. But in the spring, I brought 3 of my sons, William, Samuel, and George, as well as the Black and Larkin families, down with me. We brought more cattle and horses. So in the summer of 1805, we were basically clearing the fields where the courthouse square is today. My son William shot a huge black bear where the bank building stands today. Bear grease back then was used for almost everything. We had to use canes with black powder, gunpowder charges to blast the rattlesnakes out of the rocks around the big spring. There were so many of them. So just close your eyes for a moment and imagine this natural paradise. Around the big spring were cedar trees. To the east were poplar trees, built cabins out of, and oak. And where, imagine this, the Huntsville Hospital monstrosity stands today, you had a chestnut grove. Natural paradise. Well, more settlers began to pour in, and we enlarged the cabin to become a public house. So the original name for the community was Hunt's Station. My plan seemed to be falling in place. By 1806, both the Chickasaw and Chief Black Fox and the Cherokee officially sold their land to the U.S. government. In January of 1809, famous surveyor Thomas Freeman, who got lost coming here today apparently, he had actually helped George Washington set out Washington, D.C., remember, was sent here by the U.S. government to survey and prepare for the land auction which would be held in Nashville, Tennessee. In fact, I actually helped him establish the Huntsville Meridian, which is in Maple Hill Cemetery, north latitude 34 degrees, 45 minutes. He did the original census, which recorded 1,482 whites and 332 blacks already living here. By the way, this is going to be a boom town. By 1812, only 3 years later, there were over 5,000 here. So everybody was pouring in. I was one of the community leaders and had a reputation for helping orphans and widows with venison and corn during the difficult winters, and we should always try to help out others who are less fortunate with charitable work. In August of 1809, official federal land sales began in Nashville. Now, before Congress reformed the procedure in 1820, buying federal land was a convoluted process and ripe for graft. And just as happened in the famous Yazoo scandal in Georgia, the same thing happens here in Huntsville. So in 1820, the federal government established a new land act. You could buy as little as 80 acres for $100, down from this land sale, which required $320 for 160 acres. They actually lowered it from $2 an acre to $1.25 an acre. Indeed, the yeoman farmers, we today call working class, basically, like me, squatters who had come in for 4 years and put in sweat equity, were not able to acquire their land. 90% of them did not get the land they'd already been living on. Just before the land auction, a new group of rich and politically connected lawyers rolled in from the Broad River region in Georgia. Booze, please. Thank you. In particular, you had the original carpet and his Polk-Kent son-in-law, John Williams Walker. Well, there's some controversy about what happened in Nashville. Polk bid $23.50 per acre for my land, which I had originally tried to purchase. Surrounding tracts went for only $2 an acre. Polk was connected. Future Secretary of Treasurer William H. Crawford was one of his Georgia buddies. So it's not what you know, it's who you know, obviously. Polk's going to build a 2-story antebellum brick home known as Poplar Grove today, at the intersection of Eccles and Eustis. 6 columns, top of the hill, and he decided to rename the growing community Twickenham. He was distant relations of the British poet Alexander Pope, and that's what his estate was known as. Excuse me. I did manage to buy 80 acres, about 4 miles down what was then called the Indian Creek branch that flowed out of Big Spring. Basically, it's on what is great today where the Cadillac dealership is. But it was prone to flooding, and so I actually let it go. I moved in with my daughter, Elizabeth Ackland, and her husband, Samuel, on their farm on what is, some of you have a little bit of age, you remember the old airport. In fact, they all knew the Wright brothers. Some of you go backwards. It's what's appropriately called John Hunt Park today. Well, in 1811, there was an anti-British feeling that resulted from the so-called Red Stick Creek War, the Indian War, that morphed into what became our version of the War of 1812. The Mississippi Territorial Legislature renamed the flourishing town from Twickenham to Huntsville, and the streets were named for Revolutionary War heroes to show their disdain for the hated British. So if you go downtown, you have streets such as Nathaniel Greene, Benjamin Lincoln, George Clinton, Horatio Gates, Edmund Randolph, Patrick Henry, Albert Gallatin, Thomas Jefferson, Ben Franklin, George Washington, and everybody always asks, David Holmes and Robert Williams were actually territorial governors of Mississippi. They were not Revolutionary War heroes. So they were more contemporary to the building up of the initial Huntsville. Well, as for me, I served as coroner from 1810 to 1814. Without my own land, my name L'Oreal interviewed me in 1818. She described me as a man of steel, a man of character. The article she published said there were already 260 brick houses in Huntsville, a courthouse, a market, a bank, and that the Huntsvillians were gay, polite, hospitable, and lived in great splendor. 1818. The riverboat captain talked with me in 1820. I remained on the roll of the Masonic Lodge downtown until my death at age 72 of consumption. And the little kids at the stroll always ask me if he drank himself to death. So it's what we call tuberculosis today. And I actually do my bit from the graveside of my great-grandson, Ben Hunt, who was an editor of a Huntsville newspaper in 1878 and did a big story on the last days of his ancestor, John. I'm actually buried in an unmarked grave on my daughter's farm in what is now known as the Ackland Slitty Cemetery. It's one of 9 publicly owned cemeteries in Huntsville. So if you go behind John Hunt Park, baseball field number 2, small chain link fence, there are only 10 headstones remaining. Seems that several years ago, they put the entrance to the garbage dump through the cemetery, and much of it was lost, including my exact whereabouts. By the way, they dumped some of that dirt at Joe Davis. So a lot of people joked for years I was playing third base for the Stars. The original carpetbagger Leroy Pope has a big house. There's 79 historic markers in Madison County. Yet nowhere in Huntsville is there a statue or monument exclusively devoted to John Hunt. I'd like to see a statue with an axe in hand, the original builder here. But I want to thank you so much for your attendance today. May God continue to bless my hometown of Huntsville. All right, let me do a little post note which probably will answer some of your questions, and then I'll open it up. The family patriarch after my death was my son, Major David Hunt, who eventually settled in Franklin, Tennessee. He was the confidant of Old Hickory, Andrew Jackson, and he's with him January 8th, 1815 at the Loud Dogs. So John Coffey's Tennessee Dirty Shirts, as these sharpshooters with their Kentucky rifles were known as, killed most of the British officers that day, including General Packingham. And everybody always used to say when I was teaching history for years at Grissom, well, it was anticlimactic because they'd already signed the Treaty of Kent, officially ending that war. If the British had won at New Orleans, Admiral Cochrane would have continued the campaign, and the entire western portion of the United States would have been very much in doubt. So New Orleans is one of those crucible turning points in American history. And we can help thank John Hunt's son for that. Another son, William Hunt, stayed in Huntsville and became a mercantile merchant. He was a captain in the Seminole War. Samuel Hunt's wife is buried in Maple Hill, but they died in the same year, 1887, but there's no tombstone for him. So we lost a lot of tombstones in that old historic section. And we're speculating he's probably there, but somehow we've lost a tombstone. And we're speculating he's probably there, but somehow we've lost a tombstone. Now, the two famous daughters. I mentioned Elizabeth Ackland, who married and had 9 children, and after my death, she continued to be looked upon as kind of a political leader, basically for these yeoman farmers who weren't big money people, and most of which did not own their land. In fact, when there was a financial panic in 1819, and Pope basically reneged on the banknotes. So people got really upset at what they referred to as the Georgia aristocracy. And in fact, in 1821, they're going to elect a governor, not from Georgia, but from North Carolina, Israel Pickens. So there's a backlash eventually against Pope. It's kind of sad. His son-in-law, who had been the first U.S. senator from Alabama, actually died in 1823, so he didn't live very long after the founding of Huntsville. He had been chairman of the Constitutional Convention in 1819 that had basically allowed Alabama to acquire statehood. Now, my other daughter, Sarah, don't know very much about. She married Stephen Neal, who was the first sheriff of Huntsville. She gave birth to a son, George Neal, but shortly after that died sometime in 1818. Now the reason I mentioned Sarah is her husband had built an old-fashioned English row house without porches in what is today the site of, where do you all go at Christmas and buy your little stocking stuffers downtown? Harrison Brothers. So he owned what eventually became Harrison Brothers. But from original plans, they recreated her row house now on that southern portion of the revamped Constitution Hall Park. How many of you have been inside and looked at those original, not original, but recreated, I'll give you that moment, furnishings and so forth. So they weren't all hers, but very interesting.
Was that added when they redid?
It's been there for years, but they refurbished it. For a while, it's kind of tricky to walk down those stairs. A person of my girth, I wasn't sure if I was going to fall through or not, but it's more substantial now than what it was. So several of my descendants are buried in Maple Hill. I mentioned my great-grandson, Judge Benjamin P. Hunt, who did an article on the early suffragettes in Huntsville, and he actually was a sponsor of them. And we have a photograph of him. Of course, no photographs of John, no photography yet during his time frame. Two frequently asked questions, I'll beat you to it. Huntsville, Texas is named after John Hunt. And I was there a couple of months ago. We did the Western tour in the RV. And all my friends wondered why I was not incarcerated since I was taking photos of it. But in 1836, Ephraim Gray, who was a Huntsvillian, became the first postmaster there. So it's near the giant Lake Livingston in Texas. And the other question everybody asked about Brigadier General in the Confederate Army, John Hunt Morgan. He was named after John Hunt, but he's not a blood relation. He was born here and lived in the famous, what is now called Morgan Neal House at 558 Franklin Street. But his father had some financial difficulties and they moved to Transylvania, Kentucky. He's going to become quite famous as a Confederate raider during the Civil War. Having answered those questions, I'll open the floor real quick. I've run a little long already. Anything about Hunt or early Huntsville?
I'm on the Historical Marker Committee.
Yes.
If you will write what you want on a marker and get the city to pay for it, pick out where you want it, I'll take it from there.
I agree. So what they're going to say is there's a marker very near where his house was, and it mentions him, and it goes on about Big Spring. It's not exclusively to him.
They're not the ones who decide that.
Okay. Well, what I envisioned, how many of you sat on the lion there at Big Spring? Dean goes way back too. So we used to play there as kids. I'd love to see a statue of John Hunt there, axe in hand, since that's where it all started. But
I can only deliver a marker.
okay. Well, I appreciate that. I'll get in touch with you on that. But marker's much cheaper, I understand. And statues are controversial. Good question. Anything else? Yes, ma'am.
Total number of children.
Had 7 total children. 4 sons, 3 daughters. And again, some of them stayed in this area or Tennessee. David, Major David, who was most famous, was in Franklin, Tennessee, in what became Hunt land. So he didn't settle permanently in Huntsville. Well, thank you so very much for your attention.
governor.
Is it the governor?
Yes, sir.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Governor Clement Comer Clay, 8th Governor of the state of Alabama. And I'm referred to most of the time in the history books as Governor Clay. However, I had a pretty checkered career. I was Chief Justice of the Alabama Supreme Court. I was in the Alabama legislature. I was a United States Senator. I served on the committee that wrote the Constitution for Alabama to become a state. So it was quite a time. I grew up, born in Virginia, grew up near Knoxville, attended Blount College in Knoxville, sat and worked and practiced for the law, admitted to the bar in Tennessee, and then in 1811, I left Knoxville. A young man, I'd been on the courthouse square in a cold December afternoon in 1811 to see this young man with his horse, one servant, and a pack horse full of law books and not much else, staggered into town, settled here. And as we discussed, what was called Alabama fever was going on. People were just moving in. It was going on. People were just moving in mobs virtually. The land in Carolinas and Georgia had been overworked to the point that that land would only produce about a half a bale of cotton to an acre. And they could come to Alabama, and this rich land here would produce 2 bales an acre. One reporter who had come here to see this massive migration spoke about being here at night and on the hills all around this part of North Alabama. You see fires going, it was lit up like that. People were just coming in droves. I came, opened the law practice, rebuilt the law office right next to the Constitution Hall in Constitution Park. And that's where my law office was. And Freeman's office was right above that. Now, if you were a brand new young lawyer and people were coming in here buying land like that, it was a very strategic move. So I did well there. And then a year or so later, General Jackson came through on his way down the first Creek uprising and maneuvered all this way and served on the committee to write the Constitution. And then I began being in politics. And in about 1823, I got into it with Dr. Waddy Tate from Limestone County. We had a duel and shot each other in the legs. Later became good friends. But that sort of put a crimp in my political career. And I stayed out of politics for a few years till I finally went to the legislature, as I described. I married here. I had 3 sons. I married Suzanne Withers, and we had the 3 boys, and had a really good life. We ended up with 2 large, I guess you'd call them plantations. We did, most of the people who had land lived in the historic area and went to their land, as opposed to many places in the South where you lived on the plantation. had two, that was very successful. I was elected governor in 1835, and immediately almost the Creek Indians rose up again, and I went down again for another Creek uprising. I came back and was appointed to the Senate, and then won a seat in the United States Senate. And I stayed there. There was a Great Depression in 1837, and I stayed there a while, but our financial problems grew up, and I had to come back to North Alabama. I did work in helping in both the United States Congress in studies and wrote papers, but didn't get back into politics. Now I was, as I said, a Jacksonian Democrat. My political career was sort of like the old tale. You have one foot in the rowboat and one on the pier. If you were a Jacksonian Democrat, you were trying to appeal to the working class. It was a popular. Jackson was a populist. My friends were the Broad River gang from Pope and all of those, so I had to work at both sides of the street. In the late 1820s, and became a very outspoken supporter of the Confederacy. When the Yankees came to and occupied Huntsville during the war, they put about 10 of us in jail under the courthouse. And it was damp and bad, and I got sick, and a year after the war was over, I died. It was a colorful career. It was a great experience. That's my presentation. We're supposed to take questions now.
Question?
Yes.
You said that you lived in Twickenham, but you own 2 plantations. Where would that land be situated today?
I'm sorry, ma'am.
I'm so sorry. I said you mentioned that you lived in Twickenham, but that you own 2 plantations. Where would those plantations be situated today?
They're right, one out toward Gurdon,
Okay.
and then one down toward the south.
Toward where?
Out toward Trident. Yes.
Where do you serve as governor? Where?
Oh, shouldn't have asked that. I believe it,
Tuscaloosa.
I believe it moved to Tuscaloosa.
Would have been a Cahaba, I think.
There it is. I don't know that.
What was the divorce?
I've looked and looked and looked. There's not much information about it, and I've asked a lot of people. Nobody seems to know why it happened. It's just,
So were you both just bad shots?
sir,
I said, were you both?
Mr. Nunn said that he was leaving me the best for last, and I'm not sure that I can do my best. So anyway, my name is Louise Jordan Reynolds, and I'm the great-granddaughter of Alberta Chapman Taylor. And I brought Alberta's picture of her photograph that we have of her. And anyway, Alberta was the daughter of Governor Reuben Chapman, who was the 13th governor of Alabama, and also the daughter of Felicia. I'm sorry, I'm nervous. I know I get up and do this, but I get nervous every time, so y'all just bear with me. Closer to the mic. So also, my mother was Felicia Steptoe Pickett. And I was born on the farm, on their farm, north of Huntsville in 1853, and I died in Huntsville in 1912. But in between those times, I traveled abroad many times. I lived on the frontier, and I led a very active life. In 1880, I married a young lawyer named John Taylor. And John and I married at the Church of Nativity, which is downtown Huntsville. And shortly after we married, John moved me out to Colorado. We moved to Silverton, Colorado, which was a Wild West mining town, but we settled into Denver. And Denver is where I became very, I'm sorry, I'm so nervous, I need to calm down. I'm sorry. It's where I became involved in the women's suffrage movement. And during the 1893 convention in Colorado, which gave women the right to vote, Alberta wrote reports for the Huntsville paper. And that's where she met Susan B. Anthony and Carrie Chapman Taylor. And I don't know, a lot of people probably don't know that much about Carrie Chapman Cat, but no, Susan B. Anthony was getting on in age, and I think she probably, like a lot of the older suffragettes, brought on someone to kind of carry on her flame, and that's who Carrie Chapman Cat. And she did, she carried the flame to the end. And Miss Anthony to come to Huntsville to speak at the Huntsville City Hall. Well, my sister, Alberta, I'm Alberta, my sister, Ella Lee and Ella Lee's husband, Captain Milton Humes, planned this event. And you have to think of this event, I'm sure it was all in the papers, and the papers kind of mocked us, like, a bunch of women gonna come, and, you know, this was, you can only imagine what they said. Well, we kind of shut it down. But anyway, back then, the City Hall was located on the corner of Washington Street and Clinton Avenue. And like I said, the papers were mocking us. Well, we walked into a standing room only crowd. It was just, there wasn't a seat to be found. And the first person that was brought to speak was Susan B. Anthony. Of course, everyone knows what Susan B. Anthony looks like. I mean, all the pictures of her, you know, and I'm sure she was very intimidating, and she was up in her 70s. And she spoke eloquently and did a wonderful job. And then they brought Miss Cat. Well, she was like 180. She was a young woman, she was attractive, and she was breathing life into the women's suffrage movement. And it went so well that not only women, but men signed the suffrage petition that night. And after this event, Captain Milton Humes and my sister Ella Lee had a reception for these famous speakers, which was held at their home on Abington Avenue. Well, going on to Atlanta, Miss Anthony invited me up to the stage, and she wanted everyone to see what a woman voter looked like. That exercising her right of suffrage did not deprive a woman of her graces. This is quote unquote, I found this in the book. So anyway, so after questions and answers and all that stuff, Alberta was asked to, she was answering questions that night. And so anyway, a couple of things of him spending her money. So I can imagine that this home was,
He paid her.
what cost about $5,000 at the time. Because I have that too. I have the, and let's see if I can get a better picture of it. The DIR did a,
Where did you say the home is located?
on the Plum Avenue
It's still
in Twickenham.
It's easy to find.
It's easy to find, and this is the historic marker. This is the front and the back. And it tells her story with LE. And that happened last year. They had a DAR had a big ceremony, which was really nice. Let's see.
So you were not that old when you died.
Yeah, what was, I 53, and then I died in 1912, so. I actually, and this is Virginia Clay Clopton, her picture was taken on the porch of LE's house, Alberta's house. She actually lived there too, for a while, in her later years. In fact, I have a few of her books.
Tell me again, what is the name of the lady in the picture?
Alberta Chapman Taylor, that's who I represent today. And this is a picture of LE's home that was torn down. It was a beautiful home. And there's no homes on this street anymore. It's called Addington. It's off of Meridian Street, and everybody knows where Brooks and Collier is. You go a little bit further toward Oakwood, and you turn, I guess that's left, get up a little hill, and that's where the Hugheses lived. It was gorgeous. And of course, her picture too. So,
It's a block west of Lincoln School,
I don't know if there are any other.
or it was.
One of these are at the library and the Library of Congress. Yes, ma'am.
You know about the marker on October 24th that's being dedicated for the black?
Yes, I got a invitation, and I don't know that much about it. I know Donna Castellano is spearheading a lot of that, but I look forward to seeing that. I don't know the correlation between the white women and the African American women, and I wish I did, and I would like to think that my great grandmother, my great aunts were, very for that, and I want to think that, but,
Well, this is October 24th, for
Right.
everybody else, 2 o'clock, at Council Park, right beside the main library.
right,
And my reading said that they all work together. This is in honor of black suffragists.
that's right,
Who had worked along with the white women.
Yes.
On the same thing. But when it came time to do the rights, the black women were left out. They
Right.
didn't get to vote until 67.
that's correct, you're correct. And I think Governor Ivy, I know she'll be there, and, Tommy Ballard will be there. Anyone else?
Hey, Bill,
Hey,
I'd like to compliment all the speakers on their wonderful costumes.
that's exactly what I was going to do. We appreciate all of them being here. It's a pleasure to hear their stories and meet the three of them. Unfortunately, the cemetery stroll has been canceled this year, but we hope to be back next October full force. There are a lot of hardworking people that put this on every year, and we would love to have all of you support it and come and visit us. It's amazing how many people that have lived in Huntsville for years that have never attended the cemetery stroll. I can't imagine why not, but it's a fun afternoon. I guarantee you'll enjoy some of the brochures and so forth. Is there anything else?
Can I throw another remark out?
You may.
In my personal life, Charles, I was bivocational. I was a private investigator, and I pastored a little church in Lincoln County. And of course, on the church side, we were taught never to gossip. But Virginia Clement Clay was mentioned here. Well, she was my daughter-in-law. She was married to Clement Comer Clay. And there's historic gossip that she and Jefferson Davis kind of had a thing over. Well, one time at the stroke, I was rambling along and thought about that, and I said something about I was upset about the rumors about my daughter-in-law and so on. Let go of that. Well, you have those little groups that come around, and one lady remained, and she came up and she said she was a niece or in the family from Virginia, and she, we don't believe that. So I think I learned a very practical lesson about not being a gossip.
Thanks a lot. Is there anything else?
I have to say, I'm relatively new to the area. This stroll that you talk about in the cemetery, did I actually say there's 13,000 people that go for the stroll?
Yes, the largest crowd we've ever had was during the bicentennial, which was 1919.
But this is just one day, one afternoon.
One afternoon, Sunday afternoon, the third Sunday in October. In that particular stroll, we had over 90 characters. We normally have between 60, 75, somewhere in that vicinity. All in costume and each one with an interesting story. So come on out and hear the stories. You'll enjoy it, I guarantee you. Thank you for coming this afternoon.
Quick question before everybody leaves. Has anybody been in the new library at Richland High School on campus? Is the classroom